Well, here we are. It's Friday, October 28th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and I'm going to continue reading the introduction here of John Steinbeck's To a God Unknown. Had an interesting day so far. So somebody left a dead rat, on my windshield. Had a dead rat left on my window in Oakland one time as well. It was a rat and had its heart cut out. Excuse me, it wasn't a rat, it was a pigeon. It was a pigeon. It had its heart cut out. Like, not eaten, it was cut. The bird was cut. So, if this is somebody making death threats to me, there's been a police report. And if it's somebody practicing Santeria, I have already called the archangels and around. And all will be sent back to you. Tenfold. John Steinbeck, To a God Unknown, Introduction, Roman numeral 2. On September 12, 1933, John Steinbeck received from Robert O. Ballou, his financially beleaguered New York publisher, a small shipment of his newly printed To a God Unknown, with its dark green pictorial dust jacket designed by Steinbeck's artist friend Malone Blaine. Editor Ballou had gone out on his own after the rapid, successive bankruptcies of Jonathan Cape and then Brewer, Warren, and Putnam, publishers of Pastures of Heaven. Although several houses eventually bid for To a God Unknown, including Simon & Schuster, which would have promised more money, Steinbeck had remained loyal to Ballou's fragile shoestring operation while the publisher sought the cash necessary to bring out his two fall list books, Steinbeck's and one by Julia Peterkin. The books came this morning, and I feel I like them immensely. Thank you for doing such a fine job with them. They gave, Steinbeck confessed, more pleasure than I have felt for a number of months. His casual reply has a restrained elegance that belies the protracted and difficult history of the book's development and eventual production. In fact, in one form or another, under 3 different working titles, marking various and sometimes overlapping stages of its progress, To a God Unknown occupied Steinbeck's attention and tested his artistic mettle and resources for over 4 years. Except for the posthumously published The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights, 1976, Steinbeck labored longer on To a God Unknown than on any other book, including his 2 famous epics, The Grape of Wrath and East of Eden, 1952. The book was hellish hard to write, he told Ballou succinctly in February 1933, and he admitted, without going into details, having worked toward it for about 5 years. The history of the making of To a God Unknown is worth elaborating upon, for the story behind the story, informed by a number of heretofore unpublished primary documents, makes an intriguing tale of its own, as well as a lesson in the felicities of endurance and dedication. Neither individual expression nor cultural construction alone can fully explain the source of the creative act, which eludes final categorization. John Steinbeck was nothing if not resolutely single-minded. The process by which the book grew was not so unitary, however, because forces of every kind, from within and without, kept entering his purview, alerting his text, alerting him. Even if all those factors were known, which is doubtful, it would still be impossible to establish their priority or present them fully, so what follows here is a working sketch, a narrative in and of process. Steinbeck's novel had its roots in an unlikely source, an unfinished stage play called The Green Lady, written in the mid-20s by his Stanford University undergraduate classmate and boon companion, Webster Toby Street. In the third and only extant draft of Street's play, the action takes place in front of a room of Andy Wayne's ranch house in the Hill country of Mendocino County, California. Street's main characters include Andy Wayne, a tall, well-knit man of about 45 or more, with the characteristic stoop of one who has made his way with his hands. Mrs. Ruth Wayne, a woman about 50, and their three children, two sons, Luke, John, and one daughter, Susan, a girl of 17 or 18. In addition, a neighbor, Milton, is a suitor for Susan's hand. The Wayne family is gradually being torn apart by Andy Wayne's pathological preoccupation with the trees on his land, which make up her, the female forest, the green witch of the natural world. Seems like the whole outdoors was a green lady sometimes, Mrs. Wayne complains bitterly. As the play progresses, the drama turns on Andy's nature worship, but also on his selfish refusal to sell timber rights to raise the money necessary to send his daughter back to the University of California at Berkeley. Moreover, Andy conceives an illicit, unseemly attraction to Susie, confusing one form of natural beauty for another. Men love things 'cause they are like a woman or 'cause they're pretty. They get 'em mixed up sometimes and don't know which is which. Her jealous mother explains. In the end, Andy is supposed to die in a raging forest fire. Even though Street was an active amateur playwright who wrote all the time, by his own admission his work was not very good. In the case of the unfinished play, his dialogue and gestures are wooden, his characterizations one-dimensional and unrealized. I don't think it's anything like To a God Unknown, except that there is a pantheistic streak in it, he said in 1975, and yet, despite Street's disclaimer, in protagonist Andy Wayne's pantheism, his fatal attraction to natural and sexual forces, this otherwise uninspired melodrama does indeed contain the essential germ of Steinbeck's To a God Unknown, though it would be left entirely to Steinbeck to raise Andy Wayne's aberrant behavior to the level of Joseph Wayne's tragic obsession in this novel. Street, on the path to becoming an attorney, LLB Stanford, 1928, recognized his friend's artistic ambitions and permitted Steinbeck to novelize the original treatment, which included a prologue and first act, but only written suggestions for acts 2 and 3. Although Steinbeck may have given thought to revising the play as early as 1927, it wasn't until April 14, 1928, that he told their mutual friend Robert Cathcart, another Stanford classmate, that he was preparing to write a novel around Street's play, which he claimed has a fine thesis, and I do not know whether I have the power and acuteness and artistry to bring it out. From that point on, even though it may have been intended as a collaborative effort, Steinbeck himself worked sporadically and mostly alone at The Green Lady for the next 2 years, marking the manuscript's uneven progress in frequent letters to his close friends of the time, Albee, Cathcart, Sheffield, Williamson, poet Catherine Beswick, and lawyer Amasa Ted Miller, who, until Steinbeck signed with literary agents Mavis McIntosh and Elizabeth Otis in 1931, served as the novelist's sole representative to New York publishing houses. All of them became sounding boards for Steinbeck's artistic concerns with this book. In its first stage of composition, the book seems to have languished during much of 1928 and into 1929, that is, for about a year after Steinbeck announced his intention to adapt Street's play. In February 1929, he traveled with Street to Laytonville and its environs in Mendocino County, north of San Francisco, to visit the locale of the action and hoped to finish a draft by September. But over the next 2 months, writing went very slowly, and in early March he reported to Kate Beswick that he had temporarily fled Pacific Grove and headed for San Francisco, hoping to escape the terror of the Green Lady, by which he probably meant his own inadequacy at executing an inherited story, no matter how sympathetic he was to its basic premise. His hiatus, however, accomplished positive ends in that it allowed Steinbeck to reassess his obligation to Street's original and to initiate important modifications, some of which would have long-range results. With fresh innovations in mind, around mid-April 1929, Steinbeck started The Green Lady again, this time so enthusiastically that by May 22, 1929, he reported to Beswick that he had finished 80 pages and had set his eye confidently on completing 100 pages by June 1st. The lady progresses pretty rapidly, and it seems to be improving in fluency and ease and in interest all the time. I'm terribly anxious for you to have a look at it. I didn't make a carbon, though. What shall I do? Shall I send you the first 100 pages heavily insured? Then, if it were lost, I would be repaid for doing it again. You see, I write with a pen for 5 days of the week, and on Saturday and Sunday I type and revise the pages I have written. So if the type pages were lost, all I would have to do would be to go through the typing and revising again. Or else I would wait and send you the third draft, of which I shall make carbons. The only trouble is that I should like your criticism before I make the third draft. On his new version, Steinbeck began with a key decision to move the setting from Mendocino County, about which he felt no emotional attachment and with whose geography he was unfamiliar, to an area near Jolin in southern Monterey County, the writer's home county, and thus a familiar landscape upon which to build his dynastic tale. As a child, Steinbeck had spent summers on his Uncle Tom Hamilton's ranch in King City, not far from Jolin. The flat voice and slightly ironic tone registered in this characteristically early paragraph of The Green Lady indicates how declarative his approach was at this point. Compare the following entry with its counterpart to In a God Unknown, the opening paragraphs of Chapter 2. Jolin is a large bowl in the earth in central California. It is watered in part by two large streams, the Nacimiento and the San Antonio. It lies in the arms of the Coast Range Mountains, of which one rampart guards it from the ocean, while a smaller ridge separates it from the long, fertile Salinas Valley. On one of the river's banks sat old Mission San Antonio, surrounded by its gardens and irrigation ditches maintained by the Indians, who, in return for their labor in making bricks, digging ditches, and tilling the soil, received from the mission divine grace and cotton pants. Furthermore, instead of following Street's plan to begin in medias res, in the present, Steinbeck started in 1850, when lure of the easy money in California's goldfields was drawing men westward like Hamlin's rats, which he must have thought would lend his version greater historical reach and sociological context. Steinbeck would also develop two generations of male Waynes: Joseph, the strong father, born to be a patriarch, and husband to 3 successive wives, including his last, a Bible-reading woman named Carrie, who never quite fits into the Wayne family regime, and Andy, Joseph's strange, sensitive, prodigal son, by his second wife, Beth Willits, who would become the protagonist of The Green Lady, and of To the Unknown God. The second half of the novel was probably intended to chronicle Andy's domestic life with his new bride, Julia Sieb. In the third and final version of the novel, Steinbeck would abandon the second half. He would also transpose the fledgling story of the Lopez sisters to Chapter 7 of The Pastures of Heaven. Another element not mentioned by Street but added by Steinbeck was climatological. Steinbeck's version of The Green Lady incorporated the cyclical return of the dry years, but did not elaborate upon its effect in determining characters' actions. One of the handwritten editorial comments on the Green Lady manuscript, perhaps by Street or Beswick or Sheffield, reads, "Must show effect of the heat and dryness on Andy. The basis for one aspect of To a God Unknown's wasteland motif is evident here in the precursor draft. About every 30 years there have come periods of rainlessness to central and southern California. These desolating years seem to come creeping up out of the white desert to warn the West that it will one day die as the desert has died. They are like the reminders of death at the Egyptian feast, and now the periodic drought had settled on the land little by little. Year on year the water was sucked from the ground. The hills looked gaunt and hungry and pale. The bones of many thousands of starved cattle were whitening on the ground. 2 families of Waynes packed up their possessions and drove away. Joe watched his dying land with terror and with loathing." Several other basic elements in this originating version of The Green Lady would eventually be developed more fully in To a God Unknown. Joseph Wayne's preoccupation with fertility, a haunting green grotto in the mountains, would become the published book's mysterious glade, where much of the novel's key actions occur. Beth Willits' accidental death would be reprised in Elizabeth's death, and Andy's unconscious desire to become one with the greenness of the voluptuous forest would prefigure Joseph Wayne's attraction to the forest's curious femaleness. Thus, from its roots in a circumscribed social and familial melodrama, Steinbeck was gradually broadening the work to a larger, more elemental scope. Steinbeck's impulse to elaborate, to push the horizons of his vision to cosmogonic vistas, urged him on. 6 months later, in November 1929, Steinbeck told Beswick that The Green Lady was nearly finished. Later that year, he sent her part of the manuscript to read and comment upon, planning to cut the bad parts with her assistance, though there's no proof that this collaboration actually occurred. At some point, Webster Street may have read the typescript and made editorial comments, but given his work schedule as an attorney, he probably had little time to do so, at least in any kind of sustained fashion. Street made no mention whatsoever of being involved in the novelized version of The Green Lady, and for that matter, never mentioned the manuscript at all in his 1975 interview. So even though the title page of the manuscript read The Green Lady, a novel by John Steinbeck and Webster Street, Steinbeck was in the venture alone, and he was beginning to envision further changes that would make the material more congenial to his own imaginative and psychological demands, particularly in emphasizing Andy Wayne's delusional behavior. Through the winter of 1929 to 1930, Steinbeck kept at the book. His life, meantime, had changed significantly. In January 1930, he had married Carol Henning, a remarkably strong and independent-minded person who not only encouraged his career as a writer, but willingly shared the hard financial times of their early years together. In an effort to save both time and money, and because Carol was an incisive and effective editor, further removing Steinbeck's need to depend on Beswick and Street, in addition to her other jobs and duties, including a stint working at Ed Brickett's lab, she typed Steinbeck's books, which freed the novelist to concentrate mostly on writing and revising. Carol is a good influence on my work, he informed Carl Williamson. He agreed with her suggestion that this book was melodramatic in places, but felt that could be corrected in the next draft, for which he told Williamson he would be cutting several things out, including all of that throwback about the childhood of Carrie, which leads off the interest from the main theme. Nevertheless, he continued, I think it is a better book than I have done, though that is not much to say for it. Certainly it has more effort in it than I have ever put in anything. Part of his effort at amplifying and clarifying involved seeking the right title. As early as January 1930, Steinbeck had wanted a new name for the second stage of his manuscript. By March 10th, he had titled the book To a God Unknown. Writing from Eagle Rock near Los Angeles, where Steinbeck's were living temporarily, he explained to Ted Miller that the novel, projected to be about 375 pages or 110,000 words in length, will be done and ready in about a month. He had given it the title To the Unknown God, and am using one of the verses from the Vedic hymn of that title as a forepiece. Steinbeck wasn't sure that Robert M. McBride's publishing company would want this book because while it contained nothing particularly sexual, it was not a book that will please the great Middle West. In late March, Steinbeck told Miller that when his father read the manuscript, he was quite disgusted at the end, for he expected Andy to recover and live happily ever after. The American people demand miracles in their literature. For the first time since he had begun working on the novel, he was able to follow Edith Merrilies' advice and reduce the novel's thesis to a single dispassionate statement. It is a fairly close study of a paranoid mind and of primitive instincts of a modern man. Whether or not there is any kind of race memory in paranoia is unimportant to me. I have recounted only that such a man react in a given manner. I have seen such reactions, and I have not drawn any conclusions from such reactions. And a few weeks later he admitted to Williamson, everything has been in a haze pretty much for the last 3 weeks. I have been working to finish this manuscript, and the thing took hold of me so completely that I lost track of nearly everything else. Now the thing is done. I started rewriting this week and am not going to let it rest. Also, I have a title which gives me the greatest of pleasure. For my title I have taken one of the Vedic hymns, the name of the hymn, to the unknown God. You surely remember the hymn with its refrain at the end of each invocation, who is the God to whom we shall offer sacrifice? Steinbeck's employment of the ancient hymn to Prajapati, Supreme Lord of Creation, indicates that his story was exceeding regional concerns into a more profound and universal arena. His statement of artistic belief, written around this time to George Albee, speaks to his evolving ambitious vision. I'd rather underreach a large theme than wax redundant over a small one. I consider a magnitude of conception and paucity and execution far more desirable than a shallow conception with preciousness. Even saying perniciousness when it's preciousness. Although the novel was becoming increasingly his own property, he was still mindful of its origins in Street's play, however. So when Steinbeck sent Miller the finished manuscript in April 1930, he instructed that should McBride accept the book, Steinbeck would write a short foreword in which some mention of Toby Street would be made. He's decided that he didn't do as much on this as he at first thought he did, but such a foreword is really necessary. When To a God Unknown appeared, Steinbeck inscribed a gift copy for Toby. This isn't much like our old story, and yet it's the same story many generations later. As it turned out, however, his acknowledgment would not be needed because no publishing firm would take the novel, even though Steinbeck worked diligently in successive drafts to improve it by enlarging his characterization of the protagonist, another indication of the novel's growing reach. "I'm having a devil of a time with my new book," he wrote Albee on February 27, 1931, Steinbeck's 29th birthday. "It just won't seem to come out right. Largeness of character is difficult. Never deal with an Olympian character." For 14 months, from April 1930 to June 1931, Miller dutifully circulated to the Unknown God to numerous publishers, including McBride, John Day, Harper's, Farrar and Reinhardt, Little, Brown, and others as well, all of whom rejected the manuscript. The God must have been to 10 publishers by now, and has only received a decent note from one, John Day, Steinbeck lamented. That is a pretty fair indication of its appeal. Partway through this period, in a later postmark January 7, 1931, he registered his despair to Miller. "Rejection follows rejection. Haven't there ever been encouraging letters? Perhaps an agent with the thorough knowledge of markets would see what the message were not marketable at all, would return them on that ground. You see, the haunting thought comes that perhaps I have been kidding myself all these years, myself and other people, that I have nothing to say, or no art in saying nothing. It is 2 years since I have received the slightest encouragement, and that was short-lived." Steinbeck got his wish. By May 1931, he signed on as a client with the new firm of Mackintosh and Otis. "Carl Williamson recommended me," he told Albee, and added humorously that if he had not known their method of doing business, he should be very suspicious of their boundless enthusiasm. The upshot of this new arrangement on Steinbeck's side was a renewed vigor and confidence to a point when he most needed assurance and an abiding appreciation of and trust in Mackintosh and Otis's professional abilities. They remained his agents throughout his life and still represent his estate. On August 18, 1931, Steinbeck confessed to Mavis Mackintosh that "imperfections of the Unknown God had bothered me ever since I first submitted the book for publication. In consequence of this uneasiness, your announcement of the book's failure to find a publisher is neither unwelcome nor unpleasant to me. If I were sure of the book, I should put it aside and wait, but I know its faults. I know, though, that the story is good. I shall rewrite it immediately." Before he undertook his proposed rewriting in 1931, Mackintosh submitted the manuscript of To the Unknown God one last time to William Morrow without success, and Steinbeck, convinced more than ever of its unsellability, entered another period of indecision and self-doubt. He told Williamson, "I reread The Unknown God and was horrified at its badness as a whole. Between bouts of anger at his inadequacy with the book, in growing entanglement with the stories that would compromise the linked chapters of The Pastures of Heaven, Steinbeck proposed a solution. I guess I'll go back to The Unknown God," he informed Albee. "That title will have to be changed, because the story will be cut to pieces and the pieces refitted and changed." It seems likely that, despite Steinbeck's repeated efforts at revision and elaboration, To the Unknown God was not substantively or stylistically different from its predecessor, and so something far deeper than mechanical patching and tinkering was necessary to keep it from reading like a case history of an insane asylum, as he had once told Miller. During the following year, however, Steinbeck made his greatest leap forward when a number of unanticipated elements spurred him to complete the novel we now have. Roman numeral 3. 1932 was the breakthrough year for To a God Unknown. In the previous version, Steinbeck had treated Andy's paranoia, his incurable ailment, too clinically, he told Miller, so that Andy's only option would be to commit suicide or to become a homicidal maniac. Clearly, more complicated motivation was needed to make the new book succeed. Immediately, Steinbeck received Joseph Wayne as a chief character and collapsed the former role of patriarch Joseph and protagonist Andy into one. In so doing, Steinbeck created a character who resonated more deeply with aspects of the Old Testament Joseph in Genesis, especially in his role as chosen brother and as dreamer and visionary. Meanwhile, the epic cast of Joseph Wayne's westering journey to California promised land echoed by the biblical Joseph's removal from Egypt. As the book progressed, Joseph would increasingly and rather heavy-handedly recapitulate the overt symbology of Jesus Christ and covert symbology of a host of pagan sacrificial gods and primitive vegetation myth deities. Some critics have also drawn parallels between Joseph of Arimathea and Joseph Wayne. Eventually, Steinbeck also decided upon a new title, To a God Unknown. The unknown in this case meaning unexplored, he said, so as not to confuse it with the unknown God of St. Paul in Acts 17:22-29. Steinbeck later admitted to Ballou that he was writing a religious book, using the pure and effective religion of Bach's Art of the Fugue for inspiration and accompaniment as he wrote. But Steinbeck was explicitly rejecting mysticism, by which he meant bad, vague thinking, and things that don't really happen. His new twist on the Vedic hymn was extremely important because, as he later confided to Los Angeles book critic Wilbur Needham, the unknown God as he employed was that powerful, fruitful, and moving unconsciousness. In his new version, the God Joseph sought was not manifest in the exterior world, but resided inside himself. In directing Joseph's quest toward the deep psychic recesses, Steinbeck was drastically changing the novel's thesis, altering its ground of being. Steinbeck's new version would also be enhanced by a contemporary historical event. He had incorporated the cylindrical dry years into the fabric of the new early versions, but it functioned as backdrop rather than as a controlling metaphor. Here, the Jolan drought and its effects would create ambiance for Joseph's obsessive belief that only he can save the land, which would become the focus of the novel. Joseph's brooding concern for the wasted land reflects the role of the mythological Fisher King of Fraser's The Golden Bough and Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, two works which stand prominently behind T.S. Eliot's 1922 poem The Wasteland, as well as To a God Unknown. The Wasteland is so good. On January 25, 1932, a couple of weeks before launching his final version, Steinbeck told Mackintosh he no longer intended to merely patch up his book. It would surely show such surgery. I shall cut it in two at the break and work only at the first half, reserving the last half for some future novel. The reason for emphasizing the first half was suggested by recent and, to me, tremendous events. Do you remember the drought in Jolan that came every 35 years? We have been going through one identical with the one of 1880. Gradually, during the last 10 years, the country has been dying of lack of moisture. The dryness has peculiar effects. Diseases increase. This winter started as usual, no rain. Then, in December, the thing broke. There were 2 weeks of downpour. The rivers overflowed and took away houses and cattle and land. I seen decorous people dancing in the mud. They have laughed with a kind of crazy joy when their land was washing away. The disease is gone, and the first delirium has settled to a steady jubilance. There will be no 10 people a week taken to asylums from this country as there were last year. Anyway, there's the background. The new novel will be closely knit, and I can use much of the material from The Unknown God, but the result will be no rewritten version. No rewritten version is the key statement. 3 weeks later, on February 16, 1932, Steinbeck informed Ted Miller that he had changed the places, characters, time, theme, and thesis and name of his new novel, so it won't be so much like the first book. On March 14, 1932, he again wrote Miller, saying that he was about a third finished with the first draft of the new version, and that he liked it pretty well this time. His writing still went slowly after reading the Spangler's Decline of the West. He was unable to work for 3 weeks, but at least it was moving toward a final shape. For 2 years, Steinbeck had enjoyed the company of an informal group of inquisitive, like-minded friends at Ricketts Pacific Biological Laboratory. In early 1932, Carol started working for Ricketts, and the mutual relationship of all involved became more intense. Progressive, irreverent, freewheeling discussion on every conceivable subject and a critical bohemian attitude toward life were the order of the day. As scholar Richard Astro had shown, Steinbeck and Ricketts were immediately compatible and launched the intellectual give and take that would eventually help Steinbeck formulate his phalanx, or group man theory, prominent in later works. There are moments of it into a God Unknown, for instance, when the dancers in Chapter 16 join into one unit, as well as the shared philosophical tenets of a breaking through and non-theological thinking already evident in the novel's omniscient point of view and in Joseph Wayne's live and let live attitude that would propel their 1941 collaborative nonfiction book Sea of Cortez. Ricketts would also become the model for Doc, the protagonist of Cannery Row, published 4 years later. Besides his metaphysical discussion with Ricketts, Steinbeck also enjoyed the use of the lab's excellent library. Steinbeck had already researched Celtic and Arthurian lore, Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough, and Carl Jung's treatise on psychology and the unconscious, to cite but a few examples. And he continued to build a legitimate personal foundation of knowledge regarding what he called psychological and anthropological resources. Into this dynamic nexus of people, books, forces, and ideas, rivals entered who would further transform the novel. The first was Joseph Campbell, later to become one of the world's most famous mythologists as a result of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, 1949, and The Masks of God, 1959 to 1968. Campbell arrived in the Carmel-Monterey area in February 1932 and quickly gravitated towards Ricketts and his free-thinking cronies. Steinbeck had just started his revisited manuscript, and Campbell recalled hearing Steinbeck read sections of his first 4 days' composition to him aloud. Campbell thought the opening lacked a sensuous visual quality, and Steinbeck, impressed with the younger man's erudition and insight, decided to start over again with those qualities in mind. For a while, Campbell and Steinbeck enthusiastically shared their parallel investigations into anthropology, ethnography, psychology, primitivism, mythology, comparative religions, and Arthurian romance. The hero's spirit quest towards self-realization was to become one of Campbell's supreme subjects, so their discussions undoubtedly enlarged Steinbeck's view of Joseph Wayne's mythic dimension and the several stages of his progress from his call to action through his transformation. In the poetical and by now more visual passages of The Revised to a God Unknown that Steinbeck continued to read to him, and in Steinbeck's use of Joseph Wayne's rite of passage toward the sacred center of the world, Campbell discovered his and Steinbeck's mutual attraction to the tendency of symbolism and an essential way of apprehending and understanding reality. Campbell later recalled that he had learned as much from Steinbeck as Steinbeck had from him. In an ironic twist of life imitating art, both men shared an interest in the archetype of the eternal woman. Steinbeck's writing of Joseph Wayne's attraction to the curious femaleness of the forest of Our Lady paralleled in an uncanny way Joseph Campbell's belief in the importance of the feminine muses that leads the hero towards his destiny. This connection became extremely complicated for Campbell, who fell in love with Carol. Their mutual attraction added yet another tangled dimension to Steinbeck's work. The ritual quest of the fictive Joseph became blurred by the flesh and blood Campbell and once more slowed down Steinbeck's work on his book. And although Steinbeck, like his main character, wanted to conduct his life above pity and therefore beyond teleological categories of assigning praise and blame, he could also be jealous and manipulative. Ostensibly, he accepted the dalliance between the two platonic lovers, but he talked Carol into moving away to Montrose near Los Angeles for the next 7 months, and also wrote his true reaction to A God Unknown. The gay, alluring, lustful interloper, Benji Wayne, who earlier had nearly sung his way into the heart of Elizabeth before she married Joseph, is killed by Juanito for seducing his wife Alice. If writing well was Steinbeck's best revenge for dispatching a rival, it could also be argued that the strain of the affair gave his novel a charged quality, a sexual reverberation that earlier drafts lacked. The scene in chapter 21 when Rama and Joseph have intercourse out of need exemplifies this lusty dimension. Around the time Campbell exited the scene in the summer of 1932, an invigorated Steinbeck was having the most fun, writing 8 pages a day, and considered the book nearly half finished. In this final phase, Steinbeck discovered something about himself that would mark his writing career for the rest of the decade. He needed to feel a sense of competitiveness, needed to feel something threatening or annoying pushing back at him, creating internal stress as he composed. Campbell's involvement with Carol was one such transactional event that injected a heightened sense of life into this novel, but more lasting pressure on To a God Unknown came inadvertently from Robinson Jeffers. Beginning with Tamar and Other Poems in 1924 and continuing through 6 more volumes by 1932, Jeffers had created a unique poetry of enormous sweep and power centered around Continent's End, the California coastal landscape between Carmel and Big Sur. His long narrative poems such as Tamar, Roan Stallion, The Woman at Point Sur, and Cawdor dealt with the abhorrent and often violent behavior of contemporary people whose dramatic lives and actions resonated with mythological symbolism and erotic pantheism. Although he lacked direct evidence, Lawrence Clark Powell was intuitively right in claiming that Steinbeck was influenced by Jeffers. Again, it was Carol Steinbeck who acted as catalyst. The group was avidly reading and discussing Jeffers' work that spring when Thurso's Landing and Other Poems was published, and the poet appeared on the cover of the April 4, 1932 issue of Time, establishing him as one of the most visible contemporary American writers. Because Jeffers drew attention to a nearby part of California, Steinbeck was bound to feel nervous, threatened, even betrayed. When Carroll discovered the central message of Jeffers' earlier poem, Roan Stallion, which states, "Humanity is the mold to break away from, the crust to break, though the coal to break into the fire, tragedy that breaks man's face, and a white fire flies out of it, visions that fools him out of his limits, desire that fools him out of his limits." Ricketts and Campbell quickly realized the value of Jeffers' urge to push beyond the confines of the human ego. Jeffers was one of the few poets that have ever really influenced my own thinking and style. Campbell admitted, and Ricketts in developing two essays, The Philosophy of Breaking Through and A Spiritual Morphology of Poetry, found that Jeffers penetrated to deep levels of beyond into realms of transhuman and natural beauty in his pessimistic poems. Ricketts also found this deep thing in To a God Unknown. As a creative writer, not a scholar or scientist, Steinbeck's reactions differed from Ricketts and Campbell's by being more effective. Where others tended outward, Steinbeck tended inward. Highly respectful of Jeffers' ecological vision for the universe as an organic whole, he also felt keenly and in competitive sense the anxiety of influence which the older man's poetry embodied. An effusive 5-page letter Steinbeck wrote in late 1932 to Ballou is the vital corroborating link here, which explains what was at stake. In it, Steinbeck pointed out 3 times that Jeffers was not a native Californian, but a transplanted Pennsylvanian, another interloper into his home country. Jeffers arrived in Carmel in 1914. My country is different from the rest of the world. It seems to be one of those pregnant places from which come wonders. Lhasa is such a place. I'm trying to translate my people and my country in this book. The problem frightens me. Jeffers came into my country and felt the thing he translated it into, the symbols of Pittsburgh. I cannot write the poetry of Jeffers, but I know the God better than he does, for I was born to it, and my father was. Our bodies came from this soil. Our bones came from the limestone of our own mountains, and our blood is distilled from the juices of this earth. I tell you now that my country, 100 miles long and about 50 wide, is unique in the world. I've wanted to write this book for so long, and I've been afraid to. I've been too young, too ignorant, too thick-headed. After Roan Stallion, I thought Jeffers would do it, but he hasn't. He got caught by Spangler and high school girls and Pittsburgh, the taboos of Pittsburgh to be rebelled against. He wrote the greatest poetry since Whitman, but he didn't write my country. Perhaps he didn't want to. This was very interesting when I was reading this, because I was born in Pittsburgh, and it has been my experience that people from California really, it's a very, very insular place. And as long as I have lived here, being considered a Californian is everybody says, "Oh no, you haven't paid your dues. You haven't paid your dues." I'm like, I've paid more taxes than all you. But there's a cultural like anger towards Pittsburgh that is very much part of California, and it was part of Steinbeck. So anyway, let's see how many more pages is his introduction. It's a number of more pages. I think I will stop here because this is getting long. So we're not even to the story yet. We're still talking about the introduction, and the history is very important. It was very interesting for me as a writer to consider that this book took Steinbeck so long to write, right? Because everything that I have written has just come out of me, and I've done numerous drafts after in editing, but there hasn't really been a point where I have had to dissect and put back together the story. The stories were cohesive. It was just, issues of continuity that I dealt with. So it's just interesting to learn about somebody else's process, particularly when looking at something that is so politically relevant today as this story, talking about the drought. And so I've said that from the beginning. We have this drought going on right now, and I'm not saying that there isn't climate change and that things aren't changing and that things aren't different. But there are cycles that have existed, and the cycles of drought in California have historical precedent. And this novel is, in large part, a portrait of that history of California and people's relationship to it. So it's very interesting. We'll get to the book soon. We will. It's only 5 more pages of the introduction, so probably next time I read, we'll finish the introduction and start the first chapter.